I guess I'm one of the original grandparents of media literacy. In fact, I recently became an actual grandparent for a second time, which is a lovely experience. Just to say very briefly, I came into media education at a fairly radical time in education generally. And it's quite interesting to see so many of the questions that were around at that time kind of coming back and prompting us to think further at this point. I worked in a very mixed, socially mixed inner city school in London, where all the questions that people are asking now about race and class and gender and equity and so on were really beginning to be addressed. And media studies, teaching about media, was a key part of that. Media studies was about engaging with where students were at, as we would say at the time, which is to say, you know, it was about engaging with popular culture, and right from the start, it was about holding together the creative and the critical aspects of that. We did inherit some recipes from older generations, so probably the great-grandparents, people like Len Masterman, whose book I read as a very young beginning teacher. What I think I found certainly was that some of those recipes didn't quite apply in the situation that I was working in. So when I moved into teacher education at London University, one of the first things I did was to start collaborating with teachers to try and document and analyse what was going on in their own classrooms, what we call the messy reality of real classrooms. And I think it wasn't quite the same as some of the stuff in the recipe books. It was more complicated, more contradictory, but also in some ways more interesting. As well as looking as a researcher at teaching and learning at classrooms, I also thought that we needed to know much more about what was going on for our students in their uses of media and their engagements with media outside school, and that led me into doing audience research. And in a sense, when you step into that, a lot of the agenda of issues is prescribed. So yes, I did do projects about sex and violence. I also did projects about politics and advertising and news and so on over the years. But trying to do that not from the perspective of media effects research, you know, do bad things cause bad attitudes and false beliefs, but really trying to look at how all of that, what was going on from children's perspective. And coming on from that, I also felt it was interesting to look at media produced for children, the kind of assumptions about childhood, the ways in which children were represented in media. And in recent years, I've been increasingly doing that through a kind of historical lens, looking at the history of children's culture, the history of youth culture. So I'm still pursuing all of those things in my, doddery, grandparently way. But what is mainly engaging me now, and I guess many of you, is the debate about information, disinformation, misinformation, and what that means. I had some things to say about that earlier on today. I think it's a familiar situation and something of a dilemma that we're in, really. I think on one level, the current anxiety around misinformation provides us with an opportunity to argue our case, to say that media education is important. But I think there are also risks and difficulties and problems entailed in all of that, particularly if we want to avoid making exaggerated promises and grand claims about what we can achieve. But I'm sure these are things we'll come on and talk about.
Sal? Thank you. You know, you're in a very difficult position when you're speaking after David, and he refers to himself as being doddery and looks for some public sympathy, I think, for that, which you don't deserve. Absolutely. You're not getting it here, I think, in this audience. I find myself myself, I must admit, sort of wanting to say now for something completely different. Because, I mean, Berlin has listened to me say this now for several months. I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. I'm an observer, is the best description for somebody like me. You may know the organisation that I work for, which I lead, which is called the Media and Learning Association. We're around for about 14 years. We're an international NGO. We have 67 organisational members. We started really from the point of view of media in learning, and then we'd more and more members interested in media education, which of course brings us into the media literacy field. So we work with members that you may be familiar with, like Clémy in France, with Cavi in Finland, Media Waste in Flanders. These are all members, and we try to run opportunities for them to bring them together, to share experience. So I find myself in this kind of observational role very much, and I think that's why it's very nice to be here, and to be in such academic company as yours is really a great honour, and I've really enjoyed today. Thank you so much, because it's lovely hearing what the researchers are doing and what academia is doing in this area. The things we do, we organise conferences, online events. We're involved in lots of European projects funded either by the European Commission or funded now by EMIF, the European Media Information Fund. And I can talk all about those, and my colleagues who are here as well also are talking about some of our projects, like Lucia about TeamLit today. Igor is talking about another of our projects tomorrow, EduMake. But I think I also wanted just to reflect on the role that I find personally myself and our organisation in through EDMO, which is the European Digital Media Observatory, and I think it's a kind of a way of reflecting on what's been happening with media literacy in Europe. When EDMO first started, which is now 4 years ago, it was all about fact-checking. You know, the three main thrusts of EDMO, if you're familiar with it, was to establish mechanisms for fact-checkers to work together, to establish mechanism whereby researchers who were interested in accessing data from the platforms could come together, and people involved in policy. And media literacy was kind of on the side. It was something that, you know, maybe we should do something about media literacy as well. Then EDMO moved forward. There are now 14 hubs, so these are national or transnational hubs in Europe, where they're mimicking, if you like, what the EDMO Europe does. So they each have these 4 different strands in operation, and there's various people here. Borbala, for example, from the Hungarian one, is here in the audience as well. But by the time the second round of EDMO EU was established, media literacy suddenly became much more important, as the recognition in Europe was, we can fact check as much as we like, but it's not going to make any difference. We have to look at media literacy skills right the way across the population and in all areas of education and learning. So that's given us an interesting role, because now what we do, I have this very nice title, which is Director for Media Literacy at EDMO. Very nice, not very well paid, by the way. It's important to point that out. But it means that we work now by bringing together the media literacy parts of the hubs across Europe. And we try to find ways to establish practice. We have lots of, we have newsletters, we produce all sorts of materials. You can follow up on all of these. It's a very open organisation, I hope, as well. And we're trying to find ways to learn. And I suppose one of the biggest gaps we have is learning from researchers, because we don't have a very good connection so far with what's happening in research. So you guys are incredibly important going forward, and we have to find ways to highlight what you're doing and what's coming out. The Australian study is absolutely fascinating for us, for example, in Europe, to learn what is coming out of that. So we need to find better ways to do that. So I suppose that's my first message, is to find better ways. We talked a little bit this afternoon, Yonti and I, in the workshop upstairs, about doing research meets practice type webinars or something. A series like that might be useful. But I think we need to bridge that gap, and that's very important at the moment. So we will talk in a few minutes about the current focus on disinformation, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? Happy to talk about that as well, but that's kind of just me for now. Thanks.
Antonio. Hi. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. It's great to be here. It's really an honor, actually. So many of my mentors and people I looked up to are in the audience. You should really be up here instead of me. But I think we're all ancestors of media literacy and training. So, someday people will be looking at us as the grandparents. And it's hard to follow these two amazing speakers. It's like Led Zeppelin is the opening band. What can you do after that?
Wow.
Yeah.
I can see myself in the Led Zeppelin.
Okay, I'll be the Ramones. And I think those of you who know my work, I think I have a foot in different worlds, one in media literacy, but one in connected to environmental communication and eco-media studies. And so I want to bring in a little bit of what's happening there, because the big discussion and discourse happening in people studying media and the environment is a discussion about care. And I know that care is also being talked about in many other disciplines. And I want to put forward the argument that media education is a care discipline. All of us who get involved with media literacy, we care about knowledge, we care about student well-being, we care about democracy, we care about civic life. Perhaps we could work a little bit more on self-care. I think all of us are learning how to do that. It's not easy to do, especially if you're an academic. I want to offer the caveat that I want to avoid the rampant care washing that's going on, because as you know, Exxon cares so much about the environment. So it's a term that's highly abused. So I just want to signal that. So I think all of us know that students are struggling and they're suffering, ever since COVID in particular. And last semester I taught a class called Writing for Advocacy, the Climate Crisis. It's in the class, the students had a blog and they had to write blog posts about topics related to climate and college students. But I've taught this class 3 times, and the first few semesters, one thing I noticed was that there was something a bit mechanical about the writing. And I realized that as I was grading and reading through their work, that they didn't really care about what they were writing. And as a reader, I didn't care. So I needed to communicate to the students that this was something that we needed to really work on. And I also incorporated some assignments, including writing mission statements, having students really explore what their values are and where they're coming from. And so I really pushed them, and all the feedback I kept giving them is like, why should I care? I'm reading this. You need to convince me why I should care what you're writing about. And what was interesting was in the evaluations, I was surprised to see this. Many students said that they'd never been asked to communicate what they cared about. And it was a moving experience for them, even though they were more, combative with me in the class. But in the evaluations, I was quite surprised to see that they were actually really appreciative of the opportunity to explore what it is that moved them, and then to advocate for that. And I think this connects to something I heard a talk earlier this morning about high impact learning. And I feel like in the end, this is what the students experience. And this is, for any educator, this is gold. So we work in anthropocentric educational settings. And what that means is that education is uncaring by design. It's uncaring towards the teachers, towards the students, and towards the planet. So one way to counteract this is through extending care to the more than human world. And I feel that care is fundamental to environmental action. So I'm going to close just sharing with you some key words that I associate with care and how it connects to the environment, and how you would apply these key words in your own work is an open process. But these are the terms that I can think of: kinship, addressing power imbalance, responsibility, agency, collaboration, empathy, inclusivity, ethical communication. We don't talk enough about that. Long-term thinking, inquiry-based thinking, critical thinking, and becoming action-oriented. So thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for those openings. I actually think that's a great start, because we are looking at where we're going and what we're doing. The way that we thought about how we would process these questions is to really think about the aims and the state of the field, along then with policy and then research and practice. One of the reasons why I specifically wanted these 3 people is because they represent, to me, in many ways, exactly where it is that we stand within those realms. And see it from that very perspective. So our first question is really based on a lot of things that we've been seeing recently, which is that media literacy is increasingly seen as a solution to a whole series of problems. We've been seeing that quite a bit since 2016. It's the thing that gets said quite often. What does that actually mean? And so the question is, what are the opportunities and potential difficulties with this? And I am going to leave it open to which one of you would like to start and address it. If somebody wants to pick up from that, and then we'll go from there.
I'm happy to start. Maybe we'll just go.
We'll just keep going, whatever works. David.
Yeah, I was talking to Belina a little while ago and trying to remember when we first met. And I think it was at a conference in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1995. But in fact, systematically glamorize drug taking. And of course, if we give people a good dose of media education, are they likely to stop doing it? I think we'd all agree that it's a bit more complicated than that. But actually, in the years since my first initiation into the world of American media literacy, I've seen that logic apply to one topic after another. Drugs, sex, violence, obesity, racism, sexism, and now disinformation. The list goes on. It changes over time, but the logic, it seems to me, is always more or less the same. The media are the cause of all the problems in the world, and media literacy for many people seems to be the favourite solution to whatever problem seems to be currently preoccupying them. Now, I'd like to make it clear that in questioning that effects logic does not mean I think media have no effects whatsoever, or that media are a completely neutral or beneficial force in the world. I mean, that would be silly, and it would mean I've probably wasted most of my life. My point is, rather, that there is a tendency to oversimplification about the media, about young people, and how they relate to media, and how the media might influence their behaviour. This logic seems to, I think, oversimplify the nature of the problems themselves, violence or obesity or whatever it may be, and to oversimplify the educational process, i.e. what and how teachers might be able to do anything about these things. There's a kind of magical thinking that goes on. Many years ago, the historian Harvey Graff wrote a very important book called The Literacy Myth, talking late 80s here. And really, it's a book about how literacy has historically been presented as the solution to everybody's problems. Literacy comes across as a kind of panacea. And one could argue that, now we're in the age of the media literacy myth. There are so many fundamental political and social problems that we're facing, so many changes in the world that are making us anxious and uncertain, that if we look to media literacy as the solution, it's almost comforting, it's almost reassuring. Now, I think there is a problem here in terms of evidence. How would we ever manage to establish that media literacy makes the kind of difference that people hope that it will? And I think we'll maybe come on and talk about that a bit later. Personally, I don't think there is actually very much evidence for anything more than short-term change. But I would also say I think we're often being asked to focus on a very reductive notion of effectiveness. We have a notion that media literacy is going to be the thing that will inoculate people against these bad things, which it seems to me is a very simplistic thing to be looking for in the first place. We've had it in the debate about the pandemic. I've heard people talk about infonoculation, right? A kind of counter propaganda. And I think there is a particular problem for us here as media educators, and it's really there in the second question here. I've spent pretty much of my whole professional career, 200 years, arguing the case for media education, and there have always been steps forward and steps back. And I think it's very tempting for us to go along with the rhetoric, to jump on the bandwagon of solutionism. You got a problem, well, we can solve that problem, or we can help you solve that problem. How about media literacy? We can do that. Now, we know, or I think most of us know, that these things are not as simple as people are suggesting, but it's a chance to make our case, to get a piece of the action, and in some cases to get a piece of the funding. I think there's a danger, I'm saying, of a kind of opportunism. And while I can understand and sympathise with that, I think we need to be much more careful about the claims that we're making. Aside from anything else, I think that has consequences for us. It forces us, if I can talk about the media literacy community, because it seems incredibly diverse to me, but if we can talk about that, the danger is that we get into a kind of false consensus. We're selling media literacy, making rather grandiose and vaguely defined claims, as though we're all talking about the same thing. It then becomes very hard to dissent from that. Sorry, just one more point. I mean, and this is preoccupying me now in relation to this idea of information, misinformation, disinformation. And I talked about this morning. I think there's a lot to say about how the information gets to be defined in the way that it does in the first place. Why are we dealing with this notion of info? Is this an information problem? Is it something that is amenable to a kind of quick fix? If we only had better information, would the problems that we're talking about go away? And I think there are also some big questions about how far media and information literacy, this kind of double header, is being positioned as the solution to the problems. And I think the limitations here are often very similar to those around drugs and violence. I think some of the same simplistic logic, the same simplistic view of media, the same simplistic view of education as a form of inoculation. These things are often being presented as part of the analysis. So I think we have a problem with solutionism in this field.
Sally or Antonio, would you like to, please?
I think I'm probably more optimistic than you are, David, because I do see the opportunities. I absolutely see the opportunities. We're now engaged in discussion much more than we would have been in the past, and I think we have to take these opportunities they are, while recognising the limitations. At the moment, for example, there's a huge focus, certainly in the kind of the discussions I hear a lot of, around the easy answers. Everybody talks about pre-bunking nowadays as if it's going to fix us, all going to be absolutely fine. And then when we're asked to run, for example, within the EDMO world, we were asked to run a media literacy campaign in the run-up to the European elections. And of course, most of us within that world were saying, well, that's not a campaign. What is that? That's, running some ads, doing some information that's shared. And we could have walked away and said, no, that's not media literacy the way we like it or we approve of it. We don't want to do it, but we did it. And we believe very much, and I think there's a kind of a body of interest in at least trying what we can at this stage, working with the people that we can, but we need the information that comes from the research side of the world on sound assessment and evaluation mechanisms, being able to find ways that we can raise evidence. Many of the practitioner activities that I see taking place, certainly in Europe these days, rely on very simple methods for evaluating whether what they've done is successful or not. Simple pre- and post questionnaires, self-reflecting. Yes, I learned something. Does that carry? Is that valuable? We need you guys in research to tell us how to do this and how to do it better. And that will put us in a position to be able to put in place better media literacy initiatives. But I see the opportunities, and I think it's a pity not to take advantage of them where we can. The funding is still very limited, and the difficulty that we have certainly with funding in Europe is it simply makes us as competitors with one another, which is always, I think, a very sad state of affairs. The funding always has organisations which, we're going to go into that bid, we're not going to go into that bid, we don't tell each other about it, simply because the funding is very limited. And I think these are the kinds of things that we have to find maybe better ways of collaborating with each other, where we sort of try and build on the experiences that we have, build on the projects that have been successful, and look at what we understand as being good media literacy. And I think that leads us into a discussion maybe later on about quality.
Excellent. Antonio?
So I mentioned earlier about environmental communication, which is a discipline, if you don't know, connected to communicating about the environment. It comes out of science communication originally. How do scientists communicate their findings to the public? But it's expanded also to talking about journalism and public relations, etc. So environmental communication initially has been self-defined as a crisis discipline. And what they mean by that is the kind of topic that they are investigating is a state of environmental crisis. And okay. Better? Okay. So environmental communication self-defines itself initially as a crisis discipline, meaning that the subject matter is a matter of a very real crisis, the global environmental crisis and climate in particular. But the danger of calling yourself a crisis discipline is that you can become reactionary. So I think some of the past debates about protectionism, that certain people using media literacy to engage in radical politics, etc., has been divisive in the past. And I think what is emerging out of environmental communication is going back to what I said in my opening comments, which is to become a care discipline. And what I mean by that is the original, all those keywords that I was giving to you, which is to engage in sort of a different way of thinking about the type of education that we're doing and the kind of outcomes that we're going for. I have a very real, I'm very concerned about climate disinformation. So there's a lot of programs and interest in disinformation in media literacy. I haven't seen very much about climate disinformation. I think it's a very serious problem. I think it's one of the reasons why we're in a situation of climate inaction. It's a complex problem. I don't want to just reduce it to a matter of disinformation, but I do think that the level of climate disinformation is creating what climate communicators call a spiral of climate silence, which is that people don't want to talk about it. And the spiral of silence, as most of you probably know, is that people won't speak up if they feel like talking about something is going to be controversial or it's going to undermine their professional status, et cetera, et cetera. So what they're discussing is that to get beyond the spiral of climate silence, we have to engage in climate conversations. So, the outcome of that climate conversation is not set in stone. We don't know what happens, but we have to talk about it. So my hope would be that I don't want to just discard because of all the various problems raised about media literacy trying to be a solution to disinformation. I agree with the critique of that substantially. However, at the same time, I feel like we have to talk about climate disinformation in order to have a climate conversation. I mean, normally when I give a talk, I have a slide that says you are here, and if you've seen the graph, we're the state of the average global temperatures is quite grave, and we're all experiencing it across the world. And I don't want that to just be eliminated because we have problems with the way that this issue has been approached up to this point regarding other ways that people think about climate disinformation. So I just wanted to offer that. And just also to acknowledge that before coming up here, Julian McDougall and I were having a conversation, and he's done a lot of important research about the effects of media literacy education, or media education. And one thing that we came up with our discussion is that, in the very least, we can help change perspective. What people do with that changed perspective, that's out of our control. But I think all of us who've taught media, we've had the experience of students coming out of our classes, kind of blown up, their minds blown in a certain way. But what they do with that, we don't know. If they pick up the pieces or not, we'll see.
So I think I'm probably just putting in a plug for join us in these discussions to make our answer as a media literacy community more tangible back to the platforms, to the policymakers, to those that are in fact putting in place the policies that we all have to abide by.
Do you want to go? All right.
I'll just say something.
Yeah.
We've got one microphone.
Okay. So my caveat is I'm not a researcher, but I do review articles for journals, so I read a lot of research that people do. And one thing I'm sort of become somewhat skeptical of is kind of a typical research project where someone does an intervention where students get exposed to some kind of module on, let's say, disinformation or fake news. Then they do some kind of post-test and shows that the students were able to identify something that was fake or not real. And I'm skeptical a little bit of these studies because I think media literacy is a lifelong skill. And, I've been doing media literacy for 25 years and I still screw it up sometimes, and I still share something that I shouldn't have shared, so I don't think it's like, okay, we did this module in a class and then, that shows that they somehow achieved media literacy. I would be interested in seeing more studies which are coming out of, again, some of these other fields that I'm peripherally involved with, like in eco-cinema studies and eco-media studies, which are very much interested in affect and emotion. And I think maybe we could spend more time exploring and researching the effective response that students are having from media, because going back to the question before, which was, that people respond to more emotionally than they do based on facts. And a lot of research is about, did people understand a fact or not a fact? And I think we need to get more involved with learning about people's affective responses to media.
No, that's good. I agree 100%. A couple of quick points then. I think there is a danger as a field becomes more established and grows, that it becomes more sedimented. You have different layers of people doing different kinds of things. And I really think it's important that we bring teachers back into this equation, really. I think we're running a risk that we have academics over here talking to each other, writing for each other, as academics are required to do, in ways that only they can understand, publishing in overpriced books and journals that teachers can't get access to. You have policymakers generating bureaucratic reports and presentations full of bullet points that actually very few people on the ground actually read. And then you have teachers who are presumably sort of swapping tips about what works on a rainy Wednesday afternoon or something. I think one of the interesting things about the media education field is that we're not yet at that point of things kind of sedimenting. And this conference is a good example. We've actually got people in all sorts of different positions talking to each other. But preserving that, making that continue, is a challenge. I think I absolutely agree with what Antonio is saying about the kind of research, because I think it follows from what I said about solutionism. If media literacy is the solution to everybody's problem, then it's not unreasonable that people should ask, well, does it really do the job? Does it really make the difference? And so we have a lot of research that is driven, in my view, by a very instrumental notion of effectiveness. We need to somehow prove that media literacy is going to prevent antisocial behaviour or, drug taking, or that it's going to immunise people against disinformation, or, stop them getting fat, or whatever problem it may be that we're concerned about. And so we have a lot of researchers coming out of mainstream empiricist communications research paradigms, media effects researchers, for whom, answering questions about effectiveness is their daily business. And much of what they do is conducted in laboratories. Much of it is actually with adults or with their own older students rather than children. Much of it uses very simplistic measures, for example, of people's self-reported levels of media literacy as defined by various kind of scales and questionnaires. And I think when you read reviews of this research, one of the things that the researchers themselves will admit is that there's a very limited sense in which that kind of research is going to tell us about people's actual behaviour. outside of a testing or a very particular classroom situation. Certainly tells us very little about long-term effects. So I think it's worth saying that we don't tend to ask these questions about other areas of education. You know, if we wanted to know about science teaching or history teaching, you know, presumably we teach history because we want kids to know about history. I mean, to be historically literate, if you like. Don't take that away. But you know, we want them to be able to think historically about what is going on in the world at the present time. We have tests and examinations, but we don't really assess the effectiveness of history teaching or of particular interventions in the way that Antonio described. We actually assume that most trained professional history teachers are able to do that themselves, that they will make professional judgments about what works and what doesn't work with their students based on their knowledge and their understanding of what their students need and how their students learn. So I think my question would be, well, you know, where are teachers in this research? Back in the day, in the mists of time, back in the 1970s actually, we used to talk about the extended professional role of teachers, which meant teachers themselves being involved in research on their own practice, often quite informally, often in collaboration with others, with teachers, but also with academics, but often with a rather different power relationship between the teachers and the academics. I mean, now I'm sorry to end on a depressing note, but you know, in the UK, teachers have been steadily deprofessionalised, so that notion of teachers actually engaging in researching their own practice seems like just hippie nonsense. But I think it's, you know, it's good to see that. We have some examples of that going on here, and more power to it, really. But it's the kind of thing that we need to be supporting. Teachers need to be much more centrally involved in